So with that said, let's jump into the episode, starting with number 10. Here we have Khadija bint Khuwailid. Khadija was the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad, who she met as a widow of a very wealthy merchant. She had actually hired Muhammad before he was considered a prophet, but soon after she came to see him as a potential husband. And according to most sources, she was about 40 years old and the Prophet Muhammad was 25 years old when they got married. The Prophet Muhammad and Khadija, they had 6 children together, including 2 sons who ended up passing away as infants. While she was alive, Prophet Muhammad did not marry any other women. From there, let's move on to number 9, where we have Sada bint Zam'a. After 25 years of marriage, Khadija had passed away, so the Prophet Muhammad was left to raise a family, and he found that he couldn't really devote as much time to promoting Islam as he really wanted to, so he ended up deciding to marry again, and he chose to marry a widow by the name of Sada bint Zam'a. And the Prophet Muhammad, he looked for the approval for their marriage from her parents, and then they told him to just ask her and see if she'll accept. So of course she accepted, and they were married for 3 years before the Prophet Muhammad took another wife. Moving on now to Aisha bint Abu Bakr. Aisha was a daughter of Abu Bakr, who was one of the Prophet Muhammad's closest friends. She was married to him at a very young age, and Aisha was raised a Muslim, and after the marriage she and the Prophet Muhammad became extremely close, and Muslims believe that Aisha narrated more than 2,000 hadith, which are the record of the words and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. And Aisha was actually one of the only 3 of the Prophet Muhammad's wives who actually memorized the Quran in entirety. As years went on, Aisha was widowed at the age of around 18 or 19 years old, but she went on to teach as well as play a very significant role in the spreading of Islam for over 40 years. Number 7 brings us facts about Hafsa bint Umar ibn al-Khattab, and she was Prophet Muhammad's 4th wife, and she was also the daughter of one of the Prophet Muhammad's closest companions named Umar ibn al-Khattab. Now their marriage was more so for a political alliance, and Hafsa had been married at a young age as well. As a matter of fact, Hafsa and Aisha were the youngest of the Prophet Muhammad's wives, and both had pretty similar personalities, and it was said that they were very strong young women, and they also apparently they got along really well. The next fact involves Zainab bint Khuzaimah, and she was the first of the Prophet Muhammad's wives that did not come from the tribe of Quraysh, which the Prophet Muhammad was also from. She ended up passing away less than a year after their marriage, so because of that, there's very little known about her. But before this marriage, she earned the title of the mother of the poor due to her generosity that she showed to poor people. Okay, so for number 5, here we have Salama bint Abu Umayyah. Salama, she married the Prophet Muhammad at the age of 29 years old, and this was after her first husband had passed away. She and her husband were some of the first to leave Mecca to Medina when she was forced to separate from her husband, and also her son was abducted. And at the passing of her husband, she ended up marrying the Prophet Muhammad, and Salama, she narrated more than 300 hadiths, and there was a lot of them that related to women. Now let's look at Juwayriya bint al-Harith. Juwayriya, she came to the Prophet Muhammad's attention when she was actually captured in the battle against the tribe of Banu Mustalik. She was 20 years old at the time and the daughter of the chief Banu Mustalik, and her marriage created an alignment between her tribe as well as the Muslims. And when the Prophet Muhammad married Juwayriya, it allowed the tribe to enter Islam with honor by removing all of the humiliation of their defeat. Soon as they announced publicly that they were married, all the wars stopped, as well as all the captives of war, they were set free. And in total, Juwayriya was married to the Prophet Muhammad for 6 years. Number 3 brings us Zainab bint Jahsh. She was married first to one of the Prophet Muhammad's freed slaves, but their marriage was short-lived and it was very problematic, a whole lot of turmoil happening. So the Prophet Muhammad actually allowed them to get a divorce. Now, of course, divorce was never the ideal situation. It's very frowned upon. And also, because of divorce, it usually left the women in a more difficult situation than the man. So to satisfy everyone involved, including Zainab's family, the Prophet Muhammad ended up marrying her. And Zainab began to be very popular and known for her works of charity. For number 2, let's look at Habiba bint Abu Sufyan. Habiba is also known as Ramallah, and she was a daughter of Abu Sufyan, who was a leader of the Quraysh tribe and as well as an enemy of Islam at that time. But she stated her beliefs in Islam despite the consequences that she would face. Now, her husband had passed away after the migration to Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, and she was all alone in a foreign country with her young daughter. So, of course, she was in a very difficult situation. Now, when the Prophet Muhammad heard of this, he offered to marry her, and she accepted. And the final fact in this episode has to deal with Safiya bin Huyay ibn Akhtab. Safiya was born in Medina to the chief of the Jewish tribe Banu Nadir, and in the year 629 CE, the Muslims won the Battle of Khaybar, and Safiya was taken as a slave. Now, the Prophet Muhammad did suggest that Safiya should convert to Islam, and after she did, they got married. Now, despite her conversion though, Muhammad's other wives, they used to tease Safiya from coming from Jewish lineage, but the Prophet Muhammad, he once said this, and I quote, "If they discriminate you again, tell them that your husband is Muhammad. Your father was Prophet Aaron and your uncle was Prophet Musa. So what is there in that to be scornful about?" Safiya was 21 years old when the Prophet Muhammad passed away, and she lived for another 39 years after that. Starting at number 10, we have Nusayba bin Ka'ab. Now, this woman is a real hero and she's a tremendous fighter. She was also known as Amara, and she was part of the Battle of Uhud, where she participated by giving water to people who are thirsty and injured. And Prophet Muhammad, in that battle, he actually lost his teeth, and most of the companions either got martyred or they fled the war. Now, when Amara, she saw his face bleeding, she dropped her containers of water and she literally took up a sword of one of the escaping fighters, as well as a bow and arrow from another fighter, and she did this to defend the Prophet. She also participated in the Battle of Yamama, where she lost her hand during the battle. So she was front line. The next female companion we're going to be looking at is Asma bint Umayyas. Now, she was one of the earliest converts to Islam, and she was married to Ja'far bin Abu Talib. Now, when he was martyred in the Battle of Mu'tah, she married Abu Bakr. After he passed away, she remarried again to Abdur Rahman bin Auf. And then when he passed away, she ended up marrying Ali bin Abu Talib. So a lot of tragedy and a lot of remarrying in her life. Now, when the Prophet Muhammad was going to perform the Hajj pilgrimage, Asma was in her final trimester of pregnancy, but she was so eager to perform Hajj as well that she wasn't even worried that she was so heavily pregnant. She was determined to do it. At number 8, we have Hakim bin Harith. Now, she was a woman who was the wife of Ikrama, son of Abu Jahl, and she accepted Islam on the day of the conquest of Mecca. She also led her resistant husband to convert to Islam as well, and this took many attempts. And since he actually had run away when the Muslims gained victory, and she went to find him literally in the middle of nowhere. Then her husband was unfortunately martyred, and then she remarried. Eventually, her second husband got martyred as well, and during that battle, she tightened her clothes and pulled out some poles of the tent, and she went out and slayed 7 armed enemy men. So yeah, literally 1 woman versus 7 men, and they didn't stand a chance against her. Number 7 brings us to Sulaym bint Malhan. She was the mother of a famous companion, Anas bin Malik, and she converted to Islam before her whole family did, and her husband ended up divorcing her because she converted. Now, when Anas bin Malik turned 10 years old, Sulaym took him to the Prophet Muhammad and offered him to his services. So Prophet Muhammad took him in and he stayed with him for about 10 years. And that's one of the reasons why there's so many hadith narrated by Anas. Number 6 brings us Kansa. Her full name was Tamadur bint Amr, and she's usually referred to as Kansa though. But she was a very eloquent woman, and she was a poet. She was so great that even famous Arab poets used to call her the best of all the poets among humans and jinns. She used to cry a lot, and she cried so much that her eyes began to form dark circles around them. but her deep emotions would bring everyone else around her to cry with her. And her ability to express her emotions like this, it really carried through into her poetry. After becoming a Muslim, she was known as Kansa when the Prophet Muhammad saw her and said, Ya Kansa. Halfway in at number 5, let's look at Fatima bint Muhammad. Of course, she is the 5th child of the Prophet Muhammad and Khadija. She was born at a time when her father had begun to spend a lot of time in solitude in the mountains around Mecca, just to pray and meditate, things like that. And when she was 5 years old, she heard that her father had become the messenger of God. And his first task was to convey the news of Islam to his family and close relations. They were to worship God and only God. Now, her mother, who was a real pillar of strength and support, she spoke to Fatima at such a young age that her father was going to be doing this. And from that time, that's when she became a lot more attached and really felt a deep love for her father, Muhammad. Fatima also accompanied the Prophet when he made Umrah in the 6th year after the Hijrah, after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And then in the following year, she and her sister Kulthum, they were among the mighty group of Muslims, as well as Muhammad was there during the liberation of Mecca. Number 4 brings us Salama. Now, Salama was the wife of Prophet Muhammad also, and she was known for her beauty, her wisdom, as well as her knowledge. And get this, she also narrated 378 hadith. She used to take good care of her facial beauty, yet she was someone who was also very modest in her dressing, and she wanted other women to be modest too. It was narrated from Salama that she mentioned women's hems to the Prophet Muhammad, and he said, "Let it down a handspan." Salama said, "But that will uncover her feet." He said, "Let it down a 4 arms length, but no more than that." Next up at number 3, we have Juwayriya bint Harith. Now this woman, she was a Jewish royal. In one hadith, Aisha describes her saying this, and I quote, "She was a pleasant woman. No one saw her except he became captivated by her." But it was the beauty of her religion as she lived it out that really made her attractive. Because Aisha also said this about her: "I knew of no other woman who brought greater blessing to her people than Juwayriya." Also, her entire tribe became Muslim after she accepted Islam. Number 2 brings us Hind bin Utbah. This woman, like whatever she did it with all her heart, whether it was good or bad. And she had a lot of anger towards Muslims. She was so intense that she accompanied the army to the Battle of Uhud and wanted to disfigure Muslim bodies. Eventually, though, she converted to Islam, and because of her attitude that she previously had towards Muslims, she had a lot of remorse, and she kept doubting as to whether or not she could actually face Muhammad. And she ended up veiling her face completely so that when Prophet Muhammad saw her, he wouldn't really recognize who she was. And that's how she took her Shahada and officially became Muslim. Now we end this episode off at number 1. We have Barira. She was an Arab slave girl, and she was forced to marry another slave who was named Mughith. And he was somebody that she did not like at all. But as a slave back then, she didn't have much choice, so she had to get married to him, and she ended up having children with him. Now, Aisha, she said this: "Barira came to me and said, 'I have agreed with my masters to pay them.' And Aisha helped her get free by paying her masters a certain price, and then she was completely set free. And then when Barira was a free woman, she was given the choice to keep her marriage with her slave husband or to leave him, and she ended up choosing to leave him. Then after she left her husband, she went on to become a great scholar, and she taught Islam till the day she passed away." So with that said, moving on to the woman at number 10, we have Khadija bint Khuwaylid. She was known by the title of Mother of the Believers, and Khadija was in her 40s, and the Prophet Muhammad was 25 years old when they got married. So the Prophet Muhammad described his first wife as follows: "She believed in me when no one else did. She accepted Islam when people rejected me, and she helped and she comforted me when there was no one else to lend me a helping hand." And only after her passing did the Prophet Muhammad marry again. Khadija was the mother of 2 of Muhammad's sons who passed away young, as well as all 4 of his daughters. Moving on to the woman at number 9, we have Aisha bint Abu Bakr. She was known for her spirit as well as good memory, and she became a teacher and a narrator of the hadith, which are the traditions and pronouncements of the Prophet Muhammad. Aisha was the daughter of Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's close friend and companion, and she married Prophet Muhammad at a very young age. As a matter of fact, she was 9 years old when they got married, and she's the only one of his 13 wives who never had a husband before. At number 8, we have Fatima. Now, Fatima was Prophet Muhammad's youngest daughter, and she was deeply devoted to him and spent her spare time praying and worshiping. Fatima was also his favorite and closest daughter. She passed away 6 months after he did. She was the mother of Prophet Muhammad's grandsons, Hassan and Hussein. She is considered as a role model for Muslims, and Fatima is one of the most beloved names for Muslim girls. The woman at number 7 is Sauda bint Zam'a. Sauda was a widow and may have been as old as 55 years old when she married Muhammad. Now, there was some debate over whether or not she or Aisha was Muhammad's second wife, but the marriage seems to have been an act of graciousness that was really aimed at rescuing Sauda from a very difficult life that she had. According to many accounts, the marriage was friendly rather than a romantic marriage. Moving on now to number 6, we have Zainab bint Jahsh. She was Prophet Muhammad's cousin as well as wife, and she was described as a small and beautiful woman, but she had a very quick temper that quickly was dissipated as well. So she would get angry, but then she would release the anger really quickly. She was known for that. She was a very talented leather worker as well, and Zainab married Prophet Muhammad after her first husband's passing in the year 622. At number 5, we have Hafsa bint Umar. Hafsa was a woman who was not afraid to say what was on her mind. Unlike many of Prophet Muhammad's wives, she was previously married. Hafsa was a woman who was known to assist those who were wounded on the battlefield when her previous husband passed away. The woman at number 4 in the Prophet Muhammad's life is Hind bint Abi Umayyah. She was also known as Salama. She and her first husband were early converts to the religion of Islam, and she also had moved to both Abyssinia and Medina. And when she had married the Prophet Muhammad, she was a single mother of 4 young orphans. Moving on now to the woman at number 3, we have Habiba. She was also known as Ramla bint Abi Sufyan, and she, along with her first husband, were early converts to the religion of Islam as well. Now, there was a time when her husband had reverted to Christianity, but at the time Ramla divorced him, and then she later married the Prophet Muhammad, although they didn't initially live together. Next up at number 2, the woman we have here is Safiya bint Huyay. She was the daughter of a Jewish chieftain, and Safiya was taken captive when her husband was killed in battle by the Muslims in the year 621. And shortly after that, she converted to Islam and she married the Prophet Muhammad. And finally, at number 1, we have Zainab bint Muhammad, and she was the Prophet Muhammad's eldest daughter, and she was born in the 5th year of his first marriage when he was 30 years old, and then she converted to Islam immediately after the Prophet Muhammad declared himself to be the final prophet. Now, it's believed that she passed away during a pregnancy that ended up being a miscarriage.
Alright guys, so at number 10 is Zainab Ahmad. She was perhaps one of the most eminent Islamic scholars of the 14th century. Zainab belonged to the Hanbali school and resided in Damascus. She had acquired a number of ijazas, which are diplomas basically, in various fields, most notably in the field of hadith. In the early 14th century, she taught such books as Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, the Mutawa of Malik B, and many more. Among her students was the North African traveler Ibn Battuta. Zainab's name appears in several dozen of the isnads of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. It is important to point out that Zainab was actually one of the hundreds of female scholars of hadith during the medieval period in the Muslim world. Next up on the list is Razia Sultan, who was the ruler of the Sultanate of Delhi between 1236 and 1240. Her father Shams al-Din al-Tumish had Razia designated as heir before his death, therefore making her the official ruler of the Sultanate. She was a fairly effective ruler and was a major patron of learning, establishing schools and libraries across northern India. In all matters, she behaved like a sultan, leading armies, sitting upon the throne, and even adopting the same royal dress as her father. to the outrage of many. She also insisted on appearing unveiled in public. In 1240, she was overthrown in a rebellion by the nobles of the kingdom, who among other things were strongly opposed to being led by a woman. Well, that's really unfortunate. Go female power nonetheless. At number 8 is Al-Malika Al-Hurra Arwa Al-Saleh. Her full name is Arwa Ahmad B. Muhammad al-Saleh. From 1067 to 1138, she ruled as the Queen of Yemen in her own right. She was an Ismaili Shi'i and well-versed in various religious sciences, Quran, Hadith, as well as poetry and history. Chronicles describe her as being incredibly intelligent. Arwa was given the highest rank in the Yemeni Fatimid religious hierarchy by the Fatimid Salaf al-Muntasir. She was also known for being the first woman in the history of Islam to be given such an illustrious title and to have such authority in the religious hierarchy. It was also during her reign that Ismaili missionaries were sent to Western India, where a major Ismaili center was established at Gurjat, which continues to be a stronghold of the Ismaili Bohra faith. She played a major role in the Fatimid schism of 1094, throwing her support behind al-Mustali and later al-Tayyib, and it is a mark of her immense influence that the lands under her rule, Yemen and parts of India, would follow her in this. Indeed, Yemen became the stronghold of the Tayyibi Ismaili movement. Her reign was marked by various construction projects and improvement of Yemen's infrastructure, as well as its increased integration with the rest of the Muslim world. She was perhaps the single most important example of an independent queen in Muslim history. At number 7 is Rab'iyya al-Adawiyya. She is known to be one of the most important mystics for Sufis in the Muslim tradition. Al-Adawiyya spent much of her early life as a slave in southern Iraq before attaining her freedom. She is considered to be one of the founders of the Sufi school of divine love, which emphasizes the loving of God for his own sake rather than out of fear of punishment or desire for reward. At number 6 is Zainab Ali. She was the granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and her husband Ali bin Ali Talib. She was a leading figure of the Al-Bayt during the late 7th century and played a central role both during and after the massacre at Karbala, where her brother Al-Hussein ibn Ali and 72 of her nephews and other brothers were killed by the Umayyads. For a time, she was the effective leader of the Ahl al-Bayt and served as the primary defender of the cause of her brother, Al-Hussein. At Kufa, she defended her nephew, Ali ibn al-Hussein, from certain death by the governor of the city, and when presented to the Yazid ibn Muawiyah at Damascus, she gave such an impassioned and forceful speech at the royal court that the caliph was convinced by his advisors to release her and the prisoners taken at Karbala. Her strength, patience, and wisdom makes her one of the most important women in early Islam. Her shrine at Damascus remains a major place of visitation by both Sunnis and Shias, a fact that emphasizes the universality of her legacy among Muslims. At number 5 is Aisha bin Abi Bakr, who is a figure that requires almost no introduction. Aisha was the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, who had perhaps the most influence on the Muslim community after his death. She played a central role in the political opposition to the third and fourth caliphs, Uthman ibn Affan and Ali ibn Abi Talib, even leading an army against the latter at Barsa in 656. Although she retired from political life after her defeat, she continued to play a major role as a transmitter of Islamic teachings. She is actually one of the major narrators of hadith in the Sunni tradition. In many ways, she is among the most interesting and controversial figures in early Islam, especially since the implications of her actions for women's participation in scholarship, political life, and the public sphere clashed with later conservative conceptions of the role of women. Alright, so number 4, next up on the list, is Nusayya bin Khabi al-Ansariya, who is also known as Amara. She was a member of the Banu Najjar tribe and one of the earliest converts to Islam in Medina. As a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, there were many virtues attributed to her. She is most remembered, however, for taking part in the Battle of Uhud, in which she carried sword and shield and fought against the Meccans. She shielded the Prophet Muhammad from enemies during the battle and even sustained several wounds in front of him to protect him. It is said that after she sustained her 12th wound, she fell unconscious, and the first question she asked when she was awakened was, "Did the Prophet survive?" A testament to her loyalty and commitment to the new faith. At number 3 is Fatima al-Fihri. Fatima was one of the founders of the oldest degree-granting universities in the world. After inheriting a large fortune, she wanted to devote her money to work that would benefit the community. Thus, with her wealth, she built the Al-Qarawiyyin Mosque. From the 10th to 12th century, the mosque developed into a university known as Al-Qarawiyyin University. Today, the Guinness Book of World Records and UNESCO recognize the university to be the oldest continuously operating institution of higher education in the world. On the note of education, Nana Masu is another very famous Muslim woman in history. Nana was a princess, poet, and teacher. She was fluent in Arabic and well-versed in Arabic, Greek, and Latin classics. In 1830, she formed a group of female teachers who journeyed throughout the region to educate women in poor and rural regions. With the republication of her works that underscore women's education, she has become a rallying point for African women today. Today in northern Nigeria, Islamic women's organizations, schools, and meeting halls are frequently named in her honor. Last but certainly not least is Khadija bin Khuwaylid. Even before her famous marriage to the Prophet Muhammad, she was an important figure in her own right, being a successful merchant and one of the elite figures of Mecca. She played a central role in supporting and propagating the new faith of Islam, and has the distinction of being the first Muslim. As the Prophet Muhammad himself is believed to have said in a hadith preserved in Sahih Muslim, he says, "God Almighty never granted me anyone better in this life than her. She accepted me when people rejected me. She believed in me when people doubted me. She shared her wealth with me when people deprived me. And God granted me children only through her." Indeed, another one of the most important women of early Islam was Fatima al-Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet, by Khadija, and it is only through Fatima that the lineage of the Prophet Muhammad is preserved. These facts make Fatima and her mother Khadija among the most revered female persons in Islamic history.